Okay. For starters, why are you seeking reelection?
Well, there's still a lot of work to do, and I'm in a position where I'm able to do some of the things that are important to people of Idaho, and I want to continue working on that. Whether it is getting the ag immigration reform bill done that we've passed the House twice, it's now in the Senate. That's an issue that is vitally important to agriculture throughout this district and throughout the state. In fact, for agriculture throughout the country. So I want to continue working on that. I want to continue working on making sure the implementation of the Great American Outdoors Act goes as was intended by Congress. I'm hearing reports that there are some delays in some of the projects and stuff because of NEPA and some other things and permitting processes that needed to get done. I also want to help, frankly, fight the woke far left agenda that I think has led to record prices in gasoline and inflation and those types of things, and we got to get those things back under control. So there's a lot of reasons, there's a lot of work left to do, and I'm going to continue working on those things if the people of Idaho decide to send me back.
What would be your top three priorities if you're reelected?
Continue funding for the Idaho National Lab and growing the Idaho National Lab and what it's done, not only just for Southeast Idaho and Idaho in general, but for the country. They are the premier nuclear lab in the country. They're also very important in cybersecurity. So making sure that they have the resources to continue growing that lab. If you look at what we've been able to do over the last 20 years with my position on the Appropriations Committee, that lab has grown from 20 years ago, President Bush said the goal of the National Lab or the Idaho National Lab was to clean it up and close it down. And we've turned it into one of the premier labs in the country. And I want to continue doing that. I want to continue making sure that we have the resources for the ag farm bill that will have to be written this next year. I've been involved in the last 4 or 5 writings of the farm bill. So I know what agricultural needs. I listen to my producers and the importance of the ag bill. So having that done will be very important. And also trying to resolve the issue in the Pacific Northwest of how do we keep Idaho water for Idaho farmers instead of sending it down the river that can't be used for Idaho agriculture to recharge our aquifer or for any other purposes. That's almost 500,000 acre-feet of water that we just send down the river right now out of state to flush water over dams in state of Washington. Makes no economic sense to me. So fighting to find a solution for that train wreck that's coming down the tracks if we don't do something about it, I think is one of the priorities. Those are 3 of the top priorities. Plus, there's a whole bunch of other things that are obviously important on the agenda.
Why should voters pick you over Bryan Smith?
Well, I think my record is what's important. Not only my record, but Bryan Smith's record is in Idaho. I've been fighting for Idaho agriculture, for Idaho citizens, for as long as I've been in Congress. And I think if you ask any Idahoan or any farmer, they'll tell you that, especially in agriculture, I've been the go-to guy. When they need something, they come to me. And we've been able to deliver on a lot of things that are important to the people of Idaho. And so I stand on my record and what we've been able to do. And, and a race is always about, when it's an incumbent, it's always about an incumbent's record. And it's also, though, about an opponent's record, even if he's not serving in Congress, about his activities and what he's done. And Bryan has filed over 15,000 lawsuits against Idaho citizens and taken them to court. And I think it's devastating what he's doing. And while I'm fighting for Idaho citizens, he's taking Idaho citizens to court and harming, I think, our veterans and our police officers and other people. And that to me is a record that ought to be exposed also.
Let's talk about Salmon a little bit. Where do the efforts stand with the proposed deal right now?
Well, a little over a year ago, 1.5 years ago, we introduced a concept. After studying it for 4 years about how do we address several issues. One of them is keeping Idaho water for Idaho farmers. As I said earlier, we send nearly 500,000 acre-feet of water down the river every year. That's a lot of water. That's like 150,000 acres of potatoes that you could plant with that kind of water. So saving Idaho water for Idahoans and to recharge our aquifer that is being depleted is very important. So we introduced this, but in order to do that, to save that water, the reason we send that water down the river is theoretically to flush water over the dams in Washington, not in Idaho, the dams in Washington, and in order to save salmon. Well, it hasn't worked. We've been doing it for a number of years, and this number of salmon continue to decline. Every fish biologist I've talked to will tell you that they're going extinct if you don't do something about it. So we looked at everything that had been tried in the past, and our original thought was there's got to be a way to save these dams and also save Idaho salmon runs. We couldn't find one. We couldn't find anything that hadn't been tried yet and failed. So consequently, we put this out as a concept so that we could start this discussion in the Pacific Northwest. And believe me, it did start a discussion in the Pacific Northwest. And that's something that I think either we can solve, we can come to a solution on how to address this issue, or a judge is going to do it for us. I think that the people of the Pacific Northwest, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho can come up with a reasonable solution to save these Idaho salmon runs. It's not just Idaho salmon runs. Other salmon runs are on the endangered list also. But Idaho's particularly are going extinct. And it is caused, if you talk to any fish biologist, by the dams. There are other conditions that contribute to the loss of salmon, and that's okay. I mean, even if those were ideal, we would still lose these Idaho salmon runs if we don't do anything. The other thing is that we need to end the lawsuits that are continually going on, and we spend millions and millions of dollars every year on lawsuits on this. We put a moratorium on these lawsuits while we give this concept that we've got a plan or a chance to work. But it's going to take the people of the Pacific Northwest involved in making these final decisions. And that's where we've been the last year, is just proposing this concept, letting people talk about it and debate about it. And when I talk to people in my district in Southeast Idaho, they're going, yeah, why are we sending all this water out of state when we've got an aquifer that's being depleted and we're having irrigation restrictions? There are 100,000 less irrigated acres in Idaho today than there were when the dams were put in. So it just doesn't make sense economically what we're doing. So that's what we're looking at. And as I said, we knew when we introduced this, it would be controversial, but it's a discussion that needs to be had. And I've never shied away from controversial or difficult decisions.
The notion of dam removal has kicked up some pushback in the agricultural community, not just where I might have expected up in Lewis and places like that, but even in eastern Idaho. And I'm wondering whether you feel like there's common ground that the ag can come to a deal there.
Yeah, I think there is. In North Idaho, the challenge is that we send this 487,000 acre feet of water down the river every year because we irrigate in Southeast Idaho. That's water that's lost to us. In North Idaho, it's all dry farming. They don't really care about that water because whatever comes from the sky is what irrigates their crops. So there's a difference between Southern Idaho and Northern Idaho grain growers. They also use barging. We don't use barging in Southern Idaho. We put our grain on trucks and ship it down to Ogden. So they get a benefit of a low-cost barging. So how can you replace that barging? The biggest challenge here with almost everybody, and I understand this completely, because believe me, 5, 6, 7 years ago, if somebody would have said, we're going to take these dams out, I would have said, you're crazy, until I started to study the issue and the challenges that we face. And I'm getting more and more people in Southeast Idaho going, yeah, does this really make sense? Does it make economic sense, what we're doing? But the grain growers in Southern Idaho, they're brothers in Northern Idaho. They're kind of united and stuff and trying to fight this, and that's okay. But what I've said to them is, if you got a better plan, if you got a way to save Idaho salmon runs, if you got a way to save Idaho's water in Southern Idaho, then let me know. Don't keep it a secret. But I think there is a opportunity to come together, but it's going to take some really hard decisions and discussions among people. And I'm getting more and more people that are saying, I might not be in favor of dam removal yet, but I got to admit that this really is an issue that we've got to debate and discuss and find a solution for. Otherwise, a judge is going to do it for us, and we're not going to like what a judge says.
I guess a broader question I had about the issue is, so you're big deals like this are not something that's unfamiliar to you after Boulder White Clouds and all that. Um, do you think the current political environment, big deals like that are still possible?
Yeah, I do. It would be a bipartisan agreement between Republicans and Democrats in the Pacific Northwest. Right now, there is the Inslee-Murray group that is working on looking at what it would take if you took the dams out, what it would cost, what the replacements would be, that kind of stuff. Because you're going to have to replace the benefits of the dams. There's no doubt the dams have a benefit. They produce power, they produce barging, or allow for barging and other things. And you're going to have to replace those benefits and make the stakeholders as whole as possible. That's what we've tried to do. In Lewiston, they're going to lose their port of Lewiston because it wouldn't barge out of Lewiston anymore. But you're going to have to replace those benefits that they have from that port right now with something else in Lewiston. We've offered some alternatives to the city of Lewiston, which I think would be very beneficial to them in the long run. But that's a decision that they're going to have to make. So I think the environment is, well, let me put it this way. Whether the environment is right for it or not, it's a problem that's coming down the railroad tracks that we need to solve. And I think that a good, honest discussion about it can solve it better, as I said, than a judge.
Let's talk about immigration a little bit. Comprehensive immigration reform has been this idea that's been talked about as sort of as long as I remember hearing about politics.
You and me both.
So do you think there's some room for incremental steps? And what are the incremental steps that you are most interested in pursuing?
Well, I was always against incremental steps. I was always against an ag immigration reform proposal and stuff because I thought it took the pressure off doing more broad immigration reform bill if you started doing little sections here and there and stuff. Then I came to realize that comprehensive immigration reform is almost impossible to do. So maybe the best thing to do is to work on a plan on, and what we did was pass this ag immigration reform bill, passed it in the House twice. It's now over in the Senate. And if we can solve that problem, maybe we can use that as a model of how you could do other immigration reform packages and stuff. Now, some people are going to say, and I know my opponent says, that creating amnesty, this is anything but amnesty. You take people that are here that are undocumented, that have been working in dairies in Idaho or other agricultural pursuits, and you bring them out of the woodwork. They have to pay back taxes. They have to pay a penalty for being here undocumented. They have to do a criminal background check to make sure that they're not criminals, don't have past records and so forth. Then they have to stay employed in agriculture for a period of time to get a permanent green card, which means that they can go, if their mother dies in Mexico or Honduras or wherever they're from, they can go to the funeral and come back and still have their job and that kind of stuff. And they can keep that for a period of like 8 years. And then if they want to apply for citizenship, they can, but they don't go to the front of the line. They go to the back of the line like everybody else does. And that would probably be another 10 years or so before they would become citizens. But as I talk to a lot of the undocumented people in this country, becoming a citizen is not their top priority. It's being able to find a job and be employed and not have to worry about being picked up by Customs and Border Patrol and deported. I talked to an individual, a lady whose husband went to get his driver's license renewed, been here for 19 years, been working for 19 years. And the next time she heard from him was 2 days later, and he was in Mexico, had been deported. First time they heard about it. That's not right. We need to reform the whole system. We're hoping that doing the ag immigration reform bill can be a model for how we can do the other immigration reform bills. I think the DACA is trying to get that done, ought to be done because it just makes sense. You bring a child into this country that's 6 years old or 5 or 4 or 3, comes across the border illegal. What do you expect them to do? Say to their parents, "Oh, I can't go because that's illegal." I mean, they've known no other country. They've served in our military oftentimes and other things. So I think solving this DACA issue ought to be easier than it is. The challenge is right now you cannot do anything that touches on immigration because the word immigration is toxic with what's going on at the southern border. And until you solve this problem with the southern border and give us what we perceive to be a secure border again, instead of the nightly news seeing all the immigrants come across the Rio Grande and then being taken on airplanes at night to other cities in the United States and that kind of stuff. American people won't put up with that, and they won't buy onto any immigration reform until we have secured that border. So I had one of the people that I worked with on this immigration reform bill, one of the Democrats, Zoe Lofgren, came up to me on the floor the other day and said, is there anything, and Crapo is the main sponsor of this on the Republican side in the Senate. And she said, is there anything we can do to get Senator Crapo to move forward on this ag bill? I said, yeah. And she said, well, what's that? I said, secure the border. I said, until you secure the border, politically, it's just toxic and you can't do anything about that. So that's the first key, is securing the border.
Okay. The West has been involved, or not involved, but overtaken by a drought that is one of the worst in memory, and starting to really get bad in Idaho now. This might be a concerning year. Do you think there's room in the Farm Bill or other legislation for things that can address drought conditions and help make better use of water, and maybe, if possible, fight some of the underlying causes of drought, like climate change?
Sure. We do things in the Farm Bill with conservation reserve programs, which takes land out of production agriculture and uses it for conservation purposes, whether it's for pheasant or sage grouse or other types of purposes. And farmers get paid for putting that land in the conservation reserve program or the EQIP program or other things like that. There are a lot of programs in the Farm Bill that are meant to address those kind of concerns. Of course, the only thing that really addresses the concerns is of the drought is clouds in the sky and rain that comes down and snow. I got up the other morning and it was snowing in Idaho Falls, and while my first response was complaining that it was May and it shouldn't be snowing, then I thought, we need the water, so that's okay. But the fact is there are other things that we can do to make our forests more resilient to drought conditions and to massive wildfires. That's why the fire funding bill, that how we fund wildfires, was so important, that I passed, I want to say 3 or 4 years ago, because we treated wildfires in the West differently than we treated other natural disasters across this country. If it was a hurricane or a earthquake or tornado, FEMA went in and did the funding to repair the damage and that kind of stuff, and help with the disaster that had been caused. In wildfires, we didn't treat them like we did other natural disasters. And what it required is the Forest Service to borrow money out of every other account they had in order to fight wildfires. We had to fund the Forest Service wildfire fighting at the 10-year average, but that just kept going up, which means there wasn't as much money to do hazardous fuels reduction or timber sales or trail maintenance or other things that will help reduce those wildfires in the future. So we changed that. It took me several years to do that, to get people on board with it, but we changed it so that the Forest Service doesn't have to borrow out of their other accounts in order to fight wildfires. We treat them like other natural disasters. So there's things that we can do. And yes, this is one of the worst, potentially worst droughts that we've seen in a number of years, but hopefully we'll get through this, and hopefully the Lord will be beneficial to us and give us the rain and water we need.
The inflation rate has been climbing in the U.S. Put a lot of strain on households. I'm curious what you see as the causes of inflation. Earlier you said it was linked to a woke agenda. I have to say I don't see any obvious causal chain between wokeness and inflation. I'm curious what you see there.
It's the increased spending that has been unnecessary that has driven this inflation. Almost every economist will tell you that. Even Larry Summers, the Clinton secretary, said that this was, when we were spending all this money, this was going to cause inflation. When COVID first hit, there was a bipartisan effort among Republicans and Democrats to address the COVID relief bills. We passed, I think it was about 3 on a bipartisan basis that were absolutely necessary. We thought to keep businesses alive, to keep people employed, to keep them off the welfare rolls, increasing the welfare payments and so forth. That was a bipartisan effort. And then last year, they spent, the Democrats on them by themselves, no Republicans supported, spent $1.9 trillion on further COVID relief, when there were hundreds of billions of dollars of unspent COVID dollars still out there. Our take on it was, wait a minute, let's spend the money that we've already appropriated and see what's necessary after that. But they just went and said, oh, we got to spend this money. That's part of the woke agenda. And so they spent $1.9 trillion on that. Then they spent, I think it was $1.9 trillion on the infrastructure bill that was not paid for. It was partially paid for, but it wasn't paid for in total. And actually only 9% of that total infrastructure bill went to what you traditionally considered infrastructure, roads, bridges, airports, that kind of stuff. Now, there are other programs in there that I supported and stuff, but it should not have been part of the overall infrastructure bill. There's also other things that are important that we've discovered in this COVID environment that we're in. I think we all knew it beforehand, and that is how reliant we are on other countries for our supply chain, whether it is the precursors for our pharmaceuticals, whether it's the critical minerals and rare earths that we get from other countries. We've got to do something to start developing these minerals and so forth here in the United States. And we have most of them in the United States. The problem is they're on public lands, and trying to get permitted to get these minerals here instead of relying on China and Russia for them is the challenge that we're facing. But I think more and more there's a bipartisan members of Congress that are saying, wait a minute, we got to address this issue. We can't be reliant on China for the critical minerals that are necessary for our manufacturing. And and these minerals are necessary if you are promoting nuclear power, whether you're promoting solar power, whether you're reporting wind power, any of those types of things, these critical minerals are a critical part of it. So we shouldn't be relying on foreign countries, and that's one of the keys to it. But I think this push by this administration, one of the things that's adding to inflation, is the day that Biden took office, he declared war on the fossil fuel industry. I don't think anybody can deny that. Banned further drilling on public lands, banned the offshore drilling, the expansion of the offshore drilling, banned drilling in Anwar, which was set aside for that exact purpose and so forth. Well, guess what that does to fuel prices? Does it surprise anybody that fuel prices go up 100% from what they were or more when you declare war on the fossil fuel industry? And then they say, well, there's 9,000 permits out there that oil companies won't drill on that they've been permitted for. It's not that simple. You go out and you bid on these leases of these lands. There might be oil under there. There might not. It takes some exploration and stuff. And it's not just a matter of, well, I got the permit, I'm going to go start drilling now. And besides that, who's going to finance that if they don't know that this administration in 6 months or a year is going to start banning things again? So that's the challenge we face. The reality is, and I'm not against green energy by any stretch of the imagination. I think the economy is moving toward a more electric and so forth economy. But the push by the administration to push us beyond what we can actually do is I think, causing a lot of the problems with our fuel prices and causing this inflation also. That's part of the woke agenda.
So it sounds like a lot of what it has to do with, in your view, are on the one hand deficits, and on the other hand access to fuel or fuel policy, natural resource policy.
Yeah, that's two of the big things.
Okay. The deficit did climb a lot during the Trump administration. You voted for a lot of the measures that increased the deficit, like the tax cut. Do you have any second thoughts about those votes?
Well, I voted against a lot of the additional spending that they put on in the last couple of years. I voted for most of the Trump proposals and so forth. In fact, I voted with Trump probably more than most members of Congress, almost, I think it was 94% of the time or something like that. But, it's hard to argue with the policies that Trump put in place. We had a growing economy. We had the lowest unemployment rate among minorities and so forth. Among women, we had the lowest unemployment rate that we've ever had, and things like that. We became energy independent under Trump, something that we have been trying for a number of years. So I have a hard time arguing with his policies that were enacted. The challenge we have with the deficit, it used to be 30 years ago, say, that 70% of the budget was discretionary spending. That's the spending that the Appropriations Committee does every year on things that you typically think of as government, whether it's the Department of Defense, Veterans Affairs, Ag, Department of Commerce, Energy and Water, any of those things you typically think of as government. That was 70% of the budget. 30% of it was entitlement programs. It's Medicare, Social Security, mainly. Today, it's 70% entitlement programs and 30% discretionary programs. And when you look at the total federal budget, if we don't get control over the mandatory programs, we'll never get this budget under control. Now, do we have to control discretionary spending? Sure. The last 4 years that the Republicans controlled Congress, we actually reduced spending over that 4-year period. Actually reduced discretionary spending over that 4-year period. Somebody would have told me at the start of that you're going to have to reduce spending over 4 years. So I said, man, that's going to be tough. But we did it. And now it's going back up again. So we need to get some constraints, yes, on discretionary spending, but you've got to have the courage to address the entitlement programs. Now, some people get upset because I call them entitlement programs. That's what they're referred to. And it doesn't mean entitlement like it's a welfare program. Somebody said, I paid into Social Security my entire life. And he's right. By entitlement, I mean, if you qualify for that program, you get that benefit, whether we have any money or not. If we have to borrow money to pay you that entitlement, then you get it. That's what I mean by entitlement, not that it's a welfare program. But we've got to get these under control. One example, Social Security, when it started, there were 16 and a half workers for every retiree, and the average lifespan was 64 years old. Well, that's a system that pencils out forever. Today, there are 2.5 workers for every retiree, and the average lifespan is getting up near 80, which means people are getting Social Security longer and longer, but there's only 2.5 workers paying for the retirees, where there used to be 16 paying for the retirees. That's a system that doesn't work anymore, that will go bankrupt by, I think it's 20 or 31 or 2, something like that. It's scheduled to go bankrupt. And at that point, there will be significant cuts in Social Security benefits that have to occur. Same thing is true as Medicare. It goes bankrupt in 5 years. Congress has to have the courage to address those. I'm not talking about taking away Social Security from anybody that's currently getting or anything like that, but we have to look down the road and put these programs back on a sound footing for the future.
Okay. So when I think back about what I know about your political career, there seem to be at least three kind of things that stand out. You were known as very conservative during your time in the Idaho House. You were sort of attacked, fairly or not, by the far right, especially in the latter half of your U.S. House career. They often accuse you of being a moderate. You firmly backed President Trump. Have you changed over time?
I don't think so. I think my philosophy has stayed the same. I think that to some degree, some of these people have moved further and further to the radical right, what I call the radical right. I am a very conservative Republican. There's no doubt about it. But what else are they going to say about me? That I'm a rhino? I mean, of course they're going to say that. I don't know that they have any other criticisms of my record. I stand on my record and what we've been able to do. It's important to me that the federal government recognize, particularly states like Idaho that are 64% public lands, and Idaho's right to manage our affairs and so forth, and other states to do the same. And that's a position I've always had and will continue to have. It's I don't think that I've changed over the years. Actually, maybe became more educated and stuff, but on a lot of issues. But I think my philosophy has stayed pretty much the same.
There was obviously January 6th was a historic event. You've supported some efforts to investigate it and things like that.
Yeah.
Do you have concerns about the peaceful transfer of power in future elections?
No, I really don't. I don't think that this will happen again. This was a disaster that happened. That's why I supported the January 6th Commission, not the one that exists today. But when it first came about, everybody knew there was going to be a commission to investigate what the heck happened here and how did it happen? How did we had indications 2 or 3 days beforehand that something was going to happen. The FBI and the Capitol Hill Police had information on the chatter that was out there in the cyber world about something happening and stuff. Why didn't we pay attention to that? Why didn't, when President Trump requested 20,000 troops be deployed from the National Guard, why did Nancy Pelosi turn him down and the mayor of D.C. say they didn't like the optics of it stuff? I wanted an investigation just like anybody else did to find out what exactly happened and how do we prevent this in the future. Nancy Pelosi, the speaker, proposed a committee that had 14 Democrats and 7 Republicans, which meant they would decide who the staff was. They would decide what subpoenas would go out and everything else. And the Republicans said, no, that's not what's going to happen. And we negotiated with them and we came up with exactly what Republicans had asked for. That is an evenly divided committee, 7-7. It would not be members of Congress. It would be people that would be appointed by Republicans and Democrats that were experts in security and other types of fields, kind of like the 9/11 Commission, so that they would have equal authority to hire their own staff, to issue subpoenas, et cetera, et cetera. Passed the House. I voted for it. It passed the House. It got killed in the Senate. And unfortunately, what that created, and I knew this would happen, is that Nancy would appoint her own committee. And she did that. She didn't even allow Republicans to appoint the two out of, I think it was 7 members. She didn't allow Republicans to appoint the 2 Republican members, which never happens. But yes, she did that. And so what we've got is a partisan committee right now that the only thing they're trying to do is tie this on to Donald Trump. That's the only thing they're trying to do. They're not looking at what were the other causes of this. How do we prevent this from happening in the future and stuff. They're just trying to make sure that Donald Trump gets blamed for this so that he can't run for president again or whatever. And that's not what we need. What we need is a good bipartisan investigation into exactly what happened. That's where I was coming from on this. And yet I'm being criticized that I voted for Nancy's partisan 9/11 commission. There's January 6th commission. That's just not true.
Obviously Bryan Smith didn't agree to be here, but I did want to ask, you've attacked him for his debt collection business. What the response I've heard him give in the past is basically don't doctors and you were a dentist, don't they have a right to collect money that people owe them that they haven't paid?
Absolutely they do. You got to remember, these are not people that have gone out and bought a widescreen TV and haven't paid their bills or something. These are medical bills that people have. They've got medical services and they need it. And yes, the doctors need to be paid on those things. When you look at the excessive abuses that Bryan Smith and his company have employed, in fact, the Idaho legislature had to pass a law against the excessive abuses that he's practiced and so forth. Judges have told him that his fees and so forth were unconscionable. 99% interest on some of the debts and so forth. What they do is they go out and they buy the medical debt from doctors, hospitals, other things. And then they add the penalty, interest, and then attorney's fees. And that can oftentimes make the debt that someone owes go through the ceiling. And so they spend the rest of their lives trying to pay this off. He's filed over 15,000 lawsuits against Idaho citizens that are simply just trying to get by. And yes, these are elderly, they're the vets, they're disabled and other things. And I think his practices, while I support the idea that people need to pay their debts, his practices are excessive, extreme, and unconscionable, frankly.
Along with that, he's not agreed to be here. You declined to debate him. I can't think of another time when I remember you declined to debate someone. Don't you think you owed that to voters?
You know, he declined to answer the Statesman's questions that were sent out. We answered those and so forth. I don't want to be, frankly, on a stage, and I've never declined to debate anybody in the past. I debated him, I think, 3 times in 2014 when he ran against me, and I've never turned down a debate. He turned down a debate in 2014 because in the City Club in Idaho Falls, because he didn't like the moderator, wanted to pick his own moderator for it. Frankly, I just don't want to be on a stage where my only answer is going to be to say that's not true, because frankly, Bryan has a difficult time with the truth, and it seems like a campaign is always about the incumbent's record, and that's legitimate. I understand that, but if I'm just going to have to stand up there and say no, that's not true, you can make an accusation you can make an accusation in 30 seconds that might take 5 minutes to explain the reality. That's hard to do when you have 1 minute answers on each side. What I would do if I was hosting debates again, if I was the League of Women Voters and Idaho Public Television, what I would do is pick a subject, maybe a couple subjects, and I would have a half-hour debate on that subject, so that you could get the back and forths on that subject, and then maybe a half hour later or another night do another half hour on other subjects or something like that, because you need to get into these issues, and a lot of these issues are complicated. It's easy to go out there and just say Simpson wants to take water from Idaho farmers, or Simpson wants to send Idaho water out of state. Well, it takes me a little time to explain why that's not true, why we're trying to save Idaho water for Idaho farmers. You can't just say, well, that's not true. Okay, let's go on. So that's the challenge you have with these types of debates. But I will tell you, it is, I just don't want to be on a stage with someone that has trouble with truth.
Well, those were the questions I had. Other members of the board have some?
Yes, Congressman, thanks for agreeing to meet with us. I really appreciate your time.
You bet.
I want to ask you about elections and whether you have concerns about election security and integrity in the United States.
When you ask in the United States, first let me tell you about Idaho. I think Idaho has one of the most secure election systems in the country. I think our Secretary of State has done a fantastic job, and I have no doubt that Idaho elections are secure. Are there things that happen occasionally? Yeah, there are. As an example, I have a staff member who born and raised in Connecticut. She went to school at Utah State, and she now lives in Virginia and works for me. She got, I think, 3 ballots, one from Connecticut, one from Washington. One from Utah and one from Virginia. She didn't try to cheat and fill out all 3 of them. So that occasionally happens. But overall, the thing that happened in this last election was unusual in that it was in the middle of a pandemic. I believe that the Constitution says, and this is why I frankly signed on to the Texas amicus brief on the election, was not because I thought the Supreme Court would overturn the election or anything. It's because there's a question that needs to be answered. During this pandemic, we had states changing their election laws, and the Constitution says elections are conducted. We don't have a federal election, we have 50 state elections, and they're conducted under laws established by the state legislature. That's what the Constitution says. And yet we had state laws changed by governors, by secretaries of states, and by judges. So I would like that cleared up. And I think the Supreme Court needs to address that at some point in time. Otherwise, I think it's going to come back to bite us. So we need to have that. And that's why I joined the Texas amicus brief. But overall, I am concerned what Speaker Pelosi's plan is, that's called For the People Act. You always got to add this nice name to it, that would allow ballot harvesting across the country. It's only legal right now in California. And what that means is that you could go out and pass out a bunch of ballots to people, in nursing homes or other places, and then you could go collect them all, and you could drop them off at a voting booth or a drop box or something like that. No requirement that they be certified, that the signatures be verified or anything else. And in fact, you could go gather them and you could look at them and you could say, oh, well, these guys voted for the people I don't like, and throw them away and turn in the others. I mean, there's no control over it whatsoever. She wants to make that legal across the country. She wants to ban voter ID laws across the country. It would be the federal takeover of state elections. And they also had a provision in there where if you are running for Congress, not the Senate, just the House, if you are running for a House seat, and if, say, you got $100 donation from someone, the federal government would match that with $600. So your taxpayers' dollars would be used to pay for House campaigns, not Senate campaigns, mind you, just House campaigns. That's how crazy this law is. And in fact, we tried to ban ballot harvesting in our appropriation bill. We had an amendment that said ballot harvesting is illegal. And Speaker Pelosi had told all the Democrats on the committee to vote against it, and they all did. So finally we said, okay, if you're going to participate in ballot harvesting, if you're going to go out and gather up these ballots and turn them into a drop box, you have to at least be a citizen of the United States. Every Democrat voted against it. So you could be a Chinese student here at the university and go gather up ballot signatures or ballots and turn them in and stuff like that. I think at the very minimum, you ought to be a citizen of the United States. So I do have concerns about the direction that we're headed in elections. But I will tell you from those that I know about in Idaho that I have full faith and confidence in the Idaho elections officials that I think do a great job.
And so do you think it's something that Congress should get involved in one way or the other? You know, the Democrats would say we need to take federal action to protect voter rights, and the Republicans tend to say we need to act in order to protect the security of the elections. Do you think this is something that Congress needs to get involved in one way or the other? Well,
Congress is involved in it to this extent. You cannot have a law in the state. Idaho could not have a law that said, if you're black, you can't vote. Or we can't have a poll tax that discriminates somebody, or we can't have a literacy test in order to vote, and that kind of stuff. That's where the federal government's responsibility is, to make sure that we don't discriminate in our voting laws. But those laws are still established by state legislatures. And some of them, they allow mail-in. In Oregon, it's all mail-in ballots. In Idaho, that we don't do mail-in ballots like that. We do absentee ballots and other types of things, but every state is different. Let the states determine what works best in their states, is what I say. I don't want the federal government involved in it any more than it has to be to make sure that we're not discriminating against anybody.
And so do you have confidence in the results from the 2020 presidential election?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. I did want to ask a couple of other specific questions, and these may be more lightning round type of questions.
Okay.
Do you support restarting the construction of the Keystone Pipeline?
Yes.
Okay.
It's the safest way to transport oil.
Okay. Your opponent supports congressional term limits. Is that something that you would support?
No.
Okay.
Do you want to know why?
Yes.
If you want to turn over Congress to career politicians or career staff members and bureaucrats, then just put in term limits. Because there is no term limits on the staff. There is no term limits on the bureaucrats or anything else. They're going to be making all the decisions. And term limits would definitely hurt a state like Idaho or any of those that don't have a large number of delegates. If the Republicans were in charge, I guarantee you most of the chairmanships of most of the programs would go to states like Texas, Florida, Ohio, that have high Republican numbers, because they'd get together and say, hey, well, you guys take the chairman of energy and water and energy and commerce, and you take the chairman of ways and means, and we'll take the chairman of appropriate. They would divide those up, because seniority is how it's based now. And if it was the Democrats, California, New York, Illinois, they would be the main beneficiaries of a system like that. I believe there is term limits currently. It's called 2-year terms. And then you have to run for reelection. And if people don't think you've done a good job, they'll elect somebody else, and that's the way it should be.
And I wanted to ask you specifically about securing our borders. What exactly does that look like for you?
To me, I think you have to restart the fence. You have to build the fence. You have to realize that the Remain in Mexico policy was a good policy that stopped the illegal immigration to the extent that it could. You can't just allow people to come in across the border and then take them to other parts of the country and say, here's your court date. I hope you show up. Because a lot of that doesn't happen. Anybody that suggests, and Secretary Mayorkas, I pull my hair out when I listen to him, that yes, our border is secure. No, it's not. We got over 2 million illegal immigrants coming across the border. I believe in an immigration policy that makes sense. We need immigrants in this country. That's the reality. With the growing economy, we need the employment, the employees and so forth. But you can't have illegal immigration. And we've got to stop that illegal immigration, which means we have to fund the border security people and make sure they have the resources to address this. And the Remain in Mexico policy and Title 42, I think, are very important aspects of that. You'll notice under the Trump administration, we had a pretty secure border. People knew that if they crossed that border, they were going to have to go back to Mexico. They were not going to be let out in the United States. And the coyotes and stuff that are making this immigration profitable for them, I'll tell you, the fentanyl that's coming across this border, fentanyl deaths in the United States or in the state of Idaho are twice what they were last year. Suicides, or I shouldn't say suicides, but overdoses by fentanyl and stuff. We've got to stop this. If you can't control your borders, you don't have a country anymore. So to me, it is getting the necessary resources on the border and taking this seriously. And right now, this administration is not taking it seriously.
Do you think that you've been in Congress for a long time, and you've seen the changes in our culture and our politics and our discourse. Do you think that our hyper-partisanship can be solved? If so, particularly in Congress, if so, how? And if so, what part would you play in healing those divisions?
I not only think it can be, I think it has to be. We have in Congress over the years, since I've been there, seen this Congress and really the country as a whole move further and further to the left and further to the right. And that makes it more and more difficult to find solutions to problems, because frankly, every problem that has been addressed, every major solution to any problem, whether it's Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid, or any of those other programs, we're a bipartisan effort. And we need to get back to doing that. And I'll tell you just a short story on this. A few months ago, I was sitting in the cloakroom with some freshman members of Congress, about 5 or 6 of them that had actually served in state legislatures. So this was their first time in Congress. And I told them, when we get back in the majority, which I believe we will in November, I said, the adults in the room have got to stand up and say, enough of this partisanship, in that, that doesn't mean you give up what you believe in or anything like that, but we've got to make the system work again. And what happened over the years is that every time the Republicans took over from the Democrats, it was get even with the Democrats, and then the Democrats took over and it was get even with the Republicans. And it just kept escalating to where it is today. And I said, we've got to go in and we've got to write the rules of the House so that they're fair for both parties. We've got to let the committees start working so that the chairman brings a bill in, people offer amendments, you vote them up or down, you bring a bill to the floor, because the committees are where the work is really done in Congress. Instead of having major legislation written in the Speaker's office, which is happening today, which happened under Republican control. So we got to get back to normal business here and work with each other. And all of these freshmen were going, yeah, we need to do that. It's the way it worked in our state, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then one person said, except we got to make sure when we take the majority that Maxine Waters doesn't get on the banking committee because of what they did to Marjorie Taylor Greene. And I said, okay, that would be the point. The point is the adults got to stand up and say what's over is over. When it's done, it's gone. It's in the past. Let's move forward. And how do we make this institution work again? That's what Congress needs to do. We also need to do that in society in general, frankly, because society is becoming more and more polarized on both sides, and people aren't talking to one another anymore. We need to listen to each other. We don't do that anymore. So my role is, first of all, try to make Congress work again, which is what I will be striving for when we get back into Congress, and make sure that it is fair, that we can work across the aisle, that we can discuss issues. That doesn't mean you surrender what you believe in. You still fight for what you believe in. But you know what? Like Ronald Reagan said, if I can get 75% of what I want, that's a victory. And then I'll fight for the other 25% later. So.
And I ask this as a serious philosophical question. This is not meant to be a gotcha question, and you can answer it as you like. But obviously, that hyperpartisanship really accelerated with Donald Trump as president, good or bad. Are you concerned? If this healing is to happen, are you concerned about a second Trump presidency inflaming those divisions once again, making them even worse? I know a lot of people are concerned about that. People in your own party are concerned about that. Is that something that concerns you?
No, I'm not really concerned. It is the American people will make that decision should he decide to run. And one thing I do trust is the American people. They will make good decisions. And, it is, I meet people all the time who say, boy, I was so upset with Donald Trump and the way he behaved and his tweets and that kind of stuff, but I loved his policies. And that's the dichotomy you have with President Trump and stuff. I'm kind of in that. I loved his policies. Yeah, some of his tweets and stuff kind of upset me that I felt were unnecessary. But the same thing is happening now with Joe Biden, and it's just getting worse and worse. So, but I think the American people are smart enough to figure this all out.
Okay, thank you.
And then, unless Dana had some, I think that wraps us up.
No, I'm fine, thanks.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time, Congressman. We really appreciate speaking with you.
Okay, Brian. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks. You bet. Bye-bye now.